So I want to move kind of into thinking about scaling up and whether it really is the right approach. So I'm coming from a kind of a narrow view, I think, of scaling up in the United States, particularly when looked at through the lens of research. And it's very difficult to think about instructional designs for schools and scaling them up across another school, much less a whole other state or another jurisdiction and all of that. And you've done that not only across the whole nation of India, but in your own nation as well as other nations. And so how would you address the question, given the challenges of scaling up, is scaling up really the right approach? Are there some instances where that could actually inhibit the innovations and the ideas that you hope to have within trying to scale it up too much or too fast or to different places? So, Wendy, why don't we start with you?
Well, this brings me back to, I was at a conference of a bunch of kind of social entrepreneurs, maybe, I don't know, maybe it was 5 years ago. And Jim Collins, the kind of best-selling business author, came in and spent some time sort of absorbing the ethos of what had become a really contentious debate about scale versus quality. And he stood up on the stage and said, before I say anything, let me just say some things should be scaled. And I think, I'm sure he said it more articulately, but you know, his essential point was everything shouldn't be scaled, but some things should be. And I think that that's actually such a relevant and powerful point. And I think really every organization needs to be really clear about its, theory of change. These are massive problems that we're working to address. And I think personally that we have, a moral imperative to address these problems at the scale and magnitude that they exist. But not every organization's, theory of change would imply that it should do that by creating more programs. In some cases, you create the beautiful high-impact program and figure out how to enable that approach to reach more kids through policy change or whatever. I just think that some, so you take a Teach for All model, essentially this is a model that says we're going to affect systemic change through cultivating a leadership force for change. Well, that leadership force better be pretty big because these are big systems and problems. So there's no way that the theory of change of this model wouldn't call for scaling. It needs to call for it's scaling with quality.
Martin, why don't we go down the line? Martin, go ahead.
I think that there is, that we are responsible for scaling. The problems in the developing world, the millions and millions of people who have no access to education or to quality education is just enormous. So it would be extremely irresponsible to continue with the status quo of having people born in the wrong zip code just not having the benefits of a dignified life. Having said that, I think that we have to be careful. Sometimes you scale the operational model, sometimes you scale the program, and sometimes you scale the philosophy. That is, you can become a bigger organization, or you can remain as you are, but you can have other people create a program similar to you, or you can have your philosophy or your goal that can be taken on by other programs like this conditional monetary transfers that was born in Brazil, and it was developed further in Mexico, and then it was brought back to Brazil, and many other countries are now using it. And then of course there is the dissemination, and then there is the branching. And so there are different ways of scaling, and it depends on the nature of the problem. What are you scaling? And second, the resources that are available. But at the end of the day, what we need to have is impact. It is not if the program has scaled that we have to measure, but what has happened to the students. That is what is important, because we can, if we scale the wrong things, we may scale bad Ministry of Education programs.
And back to my point of the United States. But let's move on to Larita, if you'd answer the question.
No, I would also say that it all depends on the context. As far as India is concerned, talking about Pratham and in my own personally, I don't think we can wait anymore. We waited enough. And I think every day, like it said, no, that the child is, for the child today, you need to work with him for today. He can't wait for tomorrow. So I feel programs need to be scaled up, but it depends on what you're scaling and how you're scaling. And in Pratham, what we've, I think, ideally done is that we've scaled up not the program so much, but the idea. And we are trying to, for want of a better word, selling it to the government. So that because the government is the largest organization in any country, and therefore they can take up this program on a much larger scale than a non-organization like us. Secondly, I also feel that if we are talking to communities, and if the communities take it up, it is also a kind of a scaling. But in scaling, we need not worry, or people always talk when you scale, you miss out on the quality, which is not always true. Because when you're scaling up, you also factor in the entire monitoring, so that it is not a person-specific scaling up, but it is an idea-specific scaling up. So if the persons are not there, but the ideas and the systems stay on. And I think that is what we've been able to do. So I'm all for scaling up, but one needs to see whether the organization and the people therein are ready for it. And I also feel what I've gained from Pratham experience is that if the idea is simple and it's doable and it is, it demonstrates result, scaling up happens much faster.
Yeah, so picking up on a couple of different things, and the other panelists have had this as well in terms of the support for scaling up, is there's both kind of macro level forces at work in terms of relationships with governments or important government entities, but it's also getting down to the local communities and making sure they're buy-in. But I want to pick up on the notion that you said about simplicity. It strikes me about all three of your approaches, they're grand ideas, but and I mean this no offense, in some ways they're simple ideas, right? And so the problem and the rub in this comes in and how these big ideas and these simple ideas are implemented. And so if you could talk a little bit about the biggest challenges you've had in terms of scaling up your reforms and what strategies you learned from that worked, maybe didn't work, that propelled your organization forward. So Larita, if we could begin with you and then we'll go down the line.
One, I think, challenge is that education reforms, or change in education, I think it's a slow process. So you can't always see the whole reforms, immediately. And I think that has been a challenge. Secondly, I feel that the problems that we're dealing with are enormous. They are complex. But every time we've done something, we've innovated something, we've demonstrated the results, and we've written about it, and then there is a scaling up. So the learning is that you demonstrate something, let it stabilize, and whatever the learnings are there, then you kind of scale up. Another challenge I think we have experienced is lack or absence or presence of political will. Wherever the states or the elected representatives are very happy or they want to do something on education as an agenda, you get a lot of success. But the moment they are not there, you go back to your original and you have to start everything from the basic. So this love-hate relationship, and also that, whether they're there, whether the political will is there, I think it's a huge advocacy role, and you have to be very, very persuasive, tolerant, and patient till all these changes take place. I think the other challenge that we have is that sometimes you need to have the right kind of people, both at the community level and at the government level. And as Pratham, we've not had a top-heavy organization. We have only about 130 people, but most of the people are volunteers who are not paid. So to sustain their motivation is a huge challenge. And finally, I think the challenge is that sometimes you get the 4% children who are out of school, who are not in the education net, whether they're working children. I think they pose a challenge for us as to how would we really get them in the school, or how do you get them quality.
Martin.
The biggest challenge that we have had has to do with a philosophical issue, mostly in South America, where education is considered to such degree a human right that people confuse that education is a responsibility of the state, that with the state having the monopoly over education. So we find many communities, parents and villages, and that are completely impotent, not knowing how to deal with this, because it is almost it's the system that has received constitutional rank, and people say, well, it's the government and the state. How am I going to influence it? So we need to empower people, maintain the government responsibility with education, but also empower people and communities to get involved, challenge the monopoly, and say, we would like to make this and that reform. Because or else there won't be reform. Because for there to be reform, there has to be rupture. And governments are mostly, and bureaucracies are conservative.
Good, thank you. Wendy.
There are so many different challenges in this, and you know, the first and foremost thing I think about is just leadership. You know, I mean, you know, when I think about the challenges of growth within Teach for America, when I think about the challenges facing all of these Teach for All partners, when I think about the challenge of Teach for All itself, it's always about staff capacity, you know, and if we could solve that problem, we could solve all the other problems, you know. So I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned in 20 some years in this, I mean, I wish I'd really taken all the more seriously the need to sort of build our own leadership pipelines over time. I thought, though, I mean, the other kind of central challenge, I think, in this, and it gets to this debate between scale and quality maybe, is, you know, how do you scale and attain, in some cases, you know, very significant scale without losing the kind of entrepreneurship and the kind of constant learning? And we've thought a lot about that in the context of Teach for All, and have created a model that really relies on, you know, a social entrepreneur building a locally governed social enterprise that has a vision for adapting this model in ways that are very much in sync with a small set of unifying principles, but into very diverse contexts, and then have worked to develop a network organization that sort of walks the right line between, you know, avoiding needless reinvention of wheels, you know, spreading best practices, while at the same time fostering local innovation and then capturing those innovations and feeding them back. And so I think that just considering very carefully as any organization scales, you know, how to both, you know, how to foster the right, you know, how do you get to the right balance between, you know, fostering local ownership and innovation and spreading best practices?
Yeah, so